Hello, this is Alex with another Lightroom video. Today I'm gonna process a bird picture, not because I photograph a lot of birds, but because it's actually good to show a number of techniques in Lightroom that I use more or less frequently. The picture that you're seeing is an American robin eating on a Brazilian pepper in our backyard. The robins are currently coming in quite large amounts through our county, and they've been visiting our backyard for a number of days, and it's quite enjoyable, so I made a bunch of pictures, and this one here turned out almost good. As you can see, it's at 500mm 5.6. 1/500th of a second is not really enough to capture an action shot accurately. I should have used 1/1000th of a second or 1/2000th of a second. As a result, I have a slight bit of softness here in the head of the bird, which might also be a depth of field issue at this focal length, of course. Even at 500mm, this is a very wide frame, includes a lot, so I need to crop it a little bit. But the first test that I'm going to do is to check whether all my highlights are preserved, because as you can see, the picture is a bit on the bright side. One of the brightest spots here is this part here on the bird's leg, and if I reduce the highlight, some of this is coming down. If I reduce the exposure, I can see that, yeah, I can pretty much recover all of that. So this is a good exposure to work with. I'm going to crop first. I bring up the crop tool here. Also works with the R key. And this is one of my pet peeves. I like to use a precise 2:3 crop and not the slightly off crop that my camera produces with raw files. What I like to do is get some kind of data-driven approach to cropping, and that's using a crop sensor, or in the Nikon world, DX crop. I can do that by rotating the crop twice. Rotating the crop is done by pressing the X key on the keyboard, and you see it turns into a vertical. And obviously I don't want a vertical, but now Lightroom remembers the aspect on the long side, and if I press X again, I have pretty much a DX crop, because this is the long side now is the height, and if you know about sensors, then this is how those ratios and sizes play out. So this is my DX crop that equals 750mm. I just like to have some point that helps me to understand how big the file is going to still be and what kind of resolution I work with. With my aging D800, I know this is still a 15 megapixel file, so that's just something good to have. I want to adjust the crop a little bit to make that whole picture a little bit more dynamic, and I like to do that without distraction. So I press the L key on my keyboard twice to turn off the lights, and that way I can move that frame around a little bit until I have the bird in a position where I think, yeah, here it provides a sense of direction, and I can remove some of the distractions in the background a little bit. And I like the overall positioning in the frame here now. When that is done, I can exit my crop tool by pressing the R key again, and I turn the lights back on by pressing the L key. Now I want to look at the color a little bit and at the brightness levels, as I mentioned. And I might make that picture a little bit darker because it's kind of on the bright side. I like it that way. Digital photos benefit from being exposed as brightly as possible without blowing out crucial highlights. That looks good. The color itself could maybe even be a little bit cooler, just looking at the greens here, and more green. I think that's very beneficial. And then I want to work on what distracts me in the picture and bring out what's important in the picture. I might increase the contrast a little bit so we're getting in the direction of where we have nice pop. The blacks, the shadows are awfully dark, so I want to lift those a little bit up, makes it more lively. But I think that's pretty much all I want to do in the basic panel at this time. And want to look at removing distractions. What are major distractions in this picture? The bright parts here that are blown out, the reflections of the sun on the leaves of the plant, which also occurs in the background. So it's all rather busy. And what works really well to reduce this, these bright little highlights, is to use negative clarity. In fact, when beginning to work with Lightroom, I always recommend to simply push all these sliders to their extremes to see what happens, what they do. And so if I use clarity, you see here it gets even busier when it's in a positive, and everything gets very, very soft when it's negative. The interesting thing is, with negative clarity here, you see how much of these blown out highlights and bright parts disappears here. It gets very, very soft. And of course, this doesn't look good. So what I do is I push the slider all the way to -100, and then I gradually move it back until I'm at a point where, just looking at the leaves and everything else in the frame, not at the bird, I like what I'm seeing. And with regards to softness, without looking at the slider, just looking at how it looks in the picture, I think this value here is about okay. So now this leaves my bird a little bit flat too, and I want to change that, of course. This is where masking comes in. I create a new mask and I can select the subject here, and that finds the bird quickly, but it also includes some other areas, and it missed the tail of the bird here. So I want to add something to that mask here. I need to include that tail here. I'm activating this overlay here so that I see what Lightroom has already detected and what it still needs to add to it. It might be tempting to say, well, I'm going to brush this in here, but there's actually a better way that works even for partials here, and that's adding an object. And then I mark the bird's tail here as an object itself, maybe a little bit more. And when I let go, Lightroom detects these edges quite nicely. And now all I need to do is maybe clean up the edges here a little bit. I use subtract and I use a brush. And I use a brush with a lower flow here, and you see I have a large feather active, and now I can simply brush over the edges here and remove the parts that are not bird tail, so they won't be included in my mask. And then I can look at this part here, and I make my brush really big with my mouse wheel, and I set the flow to 100 and just remove whatever Lightroom detected here, which is not bird either, the parts down here. For the purpose of demonstrating this, it obviously doesn't have to be super precise. You can adjust the flow on the fly by pressing 1 through 9 on your keyboard. So if I want a lower flow, I can press 5 and it goes down to 50, which is helpful to clean up the areas here inside and around the bird's beak in particular, because obviously these should not be affected by a mask. But then we have a pretty good mask of that bird. And obviously I don't want to make it darker, and I don't want to reduce the clarity even more. Instead, what I really want to do is I want to bring the clarity on the bird back, and maybe also increase the texture a little bit to bring out more detail in the feathers. You can see the result here. I turn the mask off and back on, so that works really well. Okay, that takes care of the bird. Now I have this area up here that I mentioned where the sharpness is just a little bit lacking, and this is something that I address with another mask. I use a brush here, and for this I simply use the texture adjustment, and I set this to 100 and I use a low flow, and then I paint over these areas here that are lacking in sharpness a little bit, and you see the texture adjustment brings some of that pop back. It's not quite enough, so maybe what I want to do is also add sharpness to that mask. And you see that way, this is 100% zoom. I can nicely bring that lacking sharpness back into the areas where it matters, because either there was a slight movement or it fell out of the area of acceptable depth of field. And this is good enough to have a nice and crisp bird here in my picture. Now I think with regards to the brightness levels, maybe I need to bring this down a little bit more, because the bird looks a little bit washed out. It's at a time where I also begin to look at color and maybe increase the vibrance a little bit so that it all looks livelier. Now here are these remaining small highlight areas that need to be addressed. And for this, guess what? I use another brush. I create a new mask, brush. I have created a preset here for this that I called the Highlight Tamer. It combines negative exposure, highlights at -100, and negative clarity. And with my brush here set to a relatively low flow, I can now zoom in here and I brush over this area of the bird, and you see I can bring those highlights back with that little brush very nicely. There's nothing blown out. I want to address these areas here on the leaves with that same brush and just bring those brightest parts down, and the same in the background. And because that's all in the blur anyway, I don't need to be very precise. I can just brush over these areas generously here and reduce these bright highlights where they are distraction. Maybe they're distracting on those berries as well. And then that looks good. And what's left now is to look at where my attention goes. And there are still areas in that picture here where I think it draws a little bit attention away. These out of focus red berries here are very distracting. Red is a color that naturally draws attention, but when it's out of focus, it's just confusing. So we want to bring that down a little bit. And guess what? I use another brush for that. And for this, I use the burn preset that I have set to -1 here for my usage. And again, with a low flow here, 50, or maybe I increase it to 70. And a very large brush, I go over these bright areas and bring them down a little bit more along the edges here as well. This bright patch of blue adds a little bit of color accent, but it shouldn't be that bright. And here in the background, those twigs, this leaf here, all that can still be a little bit darker. And you see, this is almost like adding a vignette, except that I am more selective, which you can see here. I don't need to make an already dark area even darker by a vignette, but just bring the light areas down a little bit more. I think I can get even closer here and bring those areas down. And that pretty much concludes my edit. The important takeaway here is using negative clarity to reduce small highlights, both globally and locally, combined in my highlight taming brush. And then to add that clarity back to the subject of the picture, which helps it stand out more. As a last step, I want to compare before and after by pressing the backslash key on the keyboard that's under the backspace key. And here is the before, bright, very busy frame. And then here's the after, darker, nicely saturated, beautiful colors. And I think it's clear that the bird stands out a lot more in my final edit. And that's it. I hope you liked this little video. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop me a note. Thank you. Bye.